The sound of shattering glass jolted me awake. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. Hank stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open. "Amy, what's wrong?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "I heard something break downstairs," I whispered, already swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "I'm going to check it out." Hank sat up, suddenly alert. "Wait, I'll come with you." We crept down the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath our feet. As we rounded the corner into the living room, I gasped. Hank's father, George, was sprawled on the floor, surrounded by shards of glass from a broken vase. "Dad!" Hank rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. "Dad, can you hear me?" I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "Yes, we need an ambulance," I said, my voice trembling. "My father-in-law? He's collapsed." The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, paramedics, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room. Hank paced back and forth, his face etched with worry. I sat with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, watching the second hand of the clock tick by agonizingly slowly. Finally, a doctor emerged, his expression grave. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, looking at Hank. Hank nodded, his face pale. "How's my father?" The doctor's words hit us like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, but your father didn't make it. He suffered a massive heart attack. We did everything we could, but—" I stood up, wrapping my arms around Hank as he swayed on his feet. "No," he whispered. "No, this can't be happening." The drive home was silent, the weight of our loss hanging heavy in the air. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw two figures silhouetted in the doorway, Edna, Hank's mother, and Lila, his younger sister. Edna rushed towards us as we got out of the car, her face streaked with tears. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Is George really—" Hank nodded, unable to speak. Edna let out a wail of anguish, collapsing against him. Lila stood frozen on the porch, her eyes wide with shock. As we made our way inside, I couldn't help but notice the state of the house. Dishes were piled high in the sink, clothes strewn across the living room. It was clear that Edna had been struggling to keep up with things, even before this tragedy struck. "What are we going to do?" Lila asked, her voice small and frightened. "Dad handled all the finances. We don't even know where to start." I exchanged a glance with Hank, seeing the same realization dawn in his eyes. His family needed help, and we were the only ones who could provide it. "We'll figure it out," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Maybe we should think about moving in for a while, just until things settle down." Hank squeezed my hand gratefully. "Are you sure, Amy?" "That's a big ask." I nodded, pushing down the flicker of unease in my stomach. "Of course. We're family. We'll get through this together." Edna looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but calculating. "Yes," she said slowly. "Yes, that would be for the best. You two can take the guest room upstairs." As we climbed the stairs to start packing some of our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped onto a path I couldn't easily leave. But looking at Hank's grief-stricken face, I knew I'd made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them as a team. Little did I know, as I folded our clothes into suitcases, that this decision would test the very foundations of our marriage and change our lives forever. The first rays of sunlight crept through the dusty curtains, rousing me from a fitful sleep. I stretched, my back aching from the unfamiliar mattress. 2 weeks had passed since we'd moved in with Hank's family, and I still felt like a stranger in this house. I padded downstairs, hoping to grab a quick cup of coffee before everyone else woke up. To my surprise, Edna was already in the kitchen, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. "Good morning, Amy," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm glad you're up. There's a list of chores on the fridge that need doing today." I blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, sure, I can help out, but I was planning to start looking for a job today. We can't rely on our savings forever." Edna's eyes narrowed. "A job? Don't be ridiculous. There's more than enough work to be done here. Lila and I can't manage everything on our own." Before I could respond, Hank stumbled into the kitchen, bleary-eyed and yawning. "Morning, ladies," he mumbled, kissing my cheek. Edna's demeanor instantly changed. "Oh, Hank, darling, did you sleep well? Sit down. I'll make you some breakfast." I watched, dumbfounded, as she bustled around the kitchen, fawning over her son. The list of chores was forgotten as she piled Hank's plate high with pancakes and bacon. "Mom, you don't have to do all this," Hank protested weakly. "Nonsense," Edna cooed. You're working so hard to sort out your father's affairs. It's the least I can do. I cleared my throat. I can make breakfast tomorrow, Edna. Give you a break. She waved her hand dismissively. Oh, I'm sure you have your hands full with other things, dear. Now why don't you get started on that list? Swallowing my frustration, I grabbed the list from the fridge. It was long, impossibly long for one person to complete in a day. I glanced at Hank, hoping he'd say something, but he was engrossed in his breakfast, oblivious to the tension in the room. As I started on the first task, scrubbing the bathroom tiles, Lila sauntered in, still in her pajamas. Oh, good, you're cleaning, she said, perching on the edge of the bathtub. Make sure you get behind the toilet. It's been ages since anyone did a proper job in here. I gritted my teeth. Lila, why don't you help? It would go faster with two of us. She laughed as if I'd told a particularly funny joke. Oh, Amy, I have to get ready for my job interview, remember? Not all of us can afford to be homemakers. The words stung more than I cared to admit. I watched her flounce out of the bathroom, my hands clenched around the scrub brush. The day dragged on, a blur of cleaning, cooking, and biting my tongue. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted and on edge. Hank found me in the laundry room, folding what felt like the 100th load of the day. Hey, you okay? He asked. Concern etched on his face. You've been quiet all day. I forced a smile. Just tired. It's been a long day. He wrapped his arms around me, and for a moment, I let myself relax into his embrace. I know this isn't easy, he murmured. But it's temporary, I promise. Once we get Dad's estate sorted out, things will get better. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. How could I tell him that his mother and sister were treating me like a servant? That I felt trapped and suffocated in this house? Just then, Edna's voice rang out from the kitchen. Amy, where are you? Dinner won't make itself, you know. Hank chuckled. You'd better go. You know how Mom gets when she's hungry. As I watched him walk away, whistling cheerfully, a realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't temporary. This was my new reality. And if I didn't find a way to stand up for myself soon, I'd disappear completely under the weight of Edna and Lila's demands. With a deep breath, I squared my shoulders and headed to the kitchen. Something had to change, and soon. I just hoped I had the strength to make it happen. The acrid smell of burnt toast jolted me awake. I rushed downstairs, my heart pounding, only to find Edna standing in the smoke-filled kitchen, a scowl etched on her face. Amy, she snapped. Where have you been? Look at this mess. I bit back a retort. It was barely 7 a.m. and I'd been up until midnight doing laundry. I'm sorry, Edna. I'll clean it up right away. As I scraped the charred remains into the trash, Edna hovered behind me. You know, when Hank was growing up, I always had a hot breakfast ready for him, every single morning. The implication was clear. I wasn't measuring up to her standards. I'll do better tomorrow, I promised, though the words tasted bitter on my tongue. Just then, Hank stumbled into the kitchen, yawning. Morning, everyone. What's for breakfast? Edna's demeanor changed instantly. Oh, darling, Amy burnt the toast. Why don't I whip you up some eggs? I watched, seething silently, as Edna fussed over Hank. He seemed oblivious to the tension, chatting about his plans for the day. As Hank left for work, Edna turned to me, her eyes cold. The gutters need cleaning. Lila's too busy with her job search, so you'll have to do it. I stared at her in disbelief. Edna, I've never cleaned gutters before. It could be dangerous. She waved dismissively. Nonsense. There's a ladder in the garage. Just be careful not to scratch the siding. Hours later, I found myself perched precariously on the ladder, scooping out handfuls of soggy leaves. My arms ached, and my back screamed in protest. Amy. Lila's voice startled me. I nearly lost my balance. When you're done up there, can you iron my blouse? I have another interview tomorrow. Before I could respond, she disappeared back into the house. I closed my eyes, fighting back tears of frustration. That evening, as Hank and I got ready for bed, I decided to broach the subject. Honey, don't you think your mom and Lila are being a bit demanding? Hank looked surprised. What do you mean? They're just trying to keep the house running smoothly. I took a deep breath. It feels like I'm doing everything, Hank. Your mom criticizes me constantly, and Lila treats me like her personal maid. He frowned. Come on, Amy. They're grieving. We need to cut them some slack. But what about me? I protested. I'm trying my best, but nothing I do is ever good enough. Hank sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I know it's not easy, but they're my family. Can't you just try to get along? For me? His words hit me like a slap. I turned away, blinking back tears. Sure, Hank. Whatever you say. The next morning I found a note from Edna on the kitchen counter. Amy, we're hosting a memorial luncheon for George this Saturday. I need you to clean the house top to bottom and prepare food for 30 people. Here's the menu. I stared at the extensive list, my heart sinking. How was I supposed to do all this in just 3 days? As I started gathering cleaning supplies, Lila breezed in. Oh good, you saw Mom's note. Don't forget to pick up my dry cleaning while you're out shopping for ingredients. Something inside me snapped. Lila, I can't do everything. Why don't you help with the preparations? She looked at me as if I'd grown a second head. Me? But I'm still in mourning, Amy. How could you be so insensitive? I watched her flounce out of the room, my hands shaking with suppressed rage. This was getting out of control. That night, I lay awake long after Hank had fallen asleep. I knew I should tell him how bad things had gotten, but the thought of forcing him to choose between me and his family was unbearable. As I stared at the ceiling, a chilling realization washed over me. If I didn't find a way to stand up for myself soon, I might lose myself completely in this house of emotional manipulation and endless demands. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow, I'd start looking for a job. It was time to reclaim some semblance of independence before it was too late. The aroma of freshly baked bread enveloped me as I stepped into Sweet Delight's bakery. It was my first day back at work, and the familiar scent brought a smile to my face for the first time in weeks. Amy, welcome back. Marge, the owner, greeted me warmly. We've missed you around here. I tied on my apron, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since moving in with Hank's family. Thanks, Marge, it's good to be back. As I kneaded dough and decorated cakes, the tension that had become a constant companion slowly melted away. Here, I wasn't just Hank's wife or Edna's daughter-in-law. I was Amy, the talented baker who could make buttercream roses bloom with a flick of her wrist. When I returned home that evening, the house was eerily quiet. I found Edna in the living room, her lips pressed into a thin line. Where have you been? She demanded. The laundry's piled up, and we had to order takeout for dinner. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I went back to work at the bakery, Edna. I told you I was planning to look for a job. Her eyes narrowed. A job? But who's going to take care of the house? Lila and I can't do everything ourselves. I'm still happy to help out, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But we need the extra income, and honestly, I need something for myself. Edna's face darkened. I see. So you're putting your selfish desires above the needs of this family. I'm sure Hank will be thrilled to hear that. Before I could respond, Hank walked in. Hear what? He asked, looking between us. Edna's demeanor changed instantly. Oh, Hank, darling, Amy's decided to abandon us and go back to work. Can you believe it? Hank's brow furrowed. Is that true, Amy? I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe now he'd see how unreasonable his mother was being. Yes, I started back at the bakery today. I thought it would be good for us financially. To my dismay, Hank's frown deepened. But who's going to take care of things here? Mom and Lila need help, Amy. You know that. My heart sank. I can still help out, Hank. It's just part-time for now. He shook his head. I don't know. Maybe this isn't the right time. We should be focused on family right now. I watched in disbelief as he walked away, effectively ending the conversation. Edna shot me a triumphant look before following him. The next few weeks were a blur of early mornings at the bakery and late nights catching up on housework. Edna and Lila's demands seemed to multiply, and Hank remained oblivious to my growing exhaustion. One evening, as I scrubbed the kitchen floor, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. I don't know why Hank married her. Edna's voice drifted from the living room. She's so selfish, putting her silly job before family. I know, Mom, Lila agreed. And did you see how she botched the laundry yesterday? My favorite blouse is ruined. We need to do something, Edna said, her voice low and determined. For Hank's sake, he deserves better than this. I sat back on my heels, my heart pounding. They were actively plotting against me. And Hank, would he believe them over me? Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Marge. Amy, I need you to open the bakery tomorrow. Early delivery coming in. Can you be here by 4 a.m.? I stared at the message, torn. If I went in early, I'd miss making Hank's breakfast. Edna would surely use that against me. But if I didn't go, I'd be letting Marge down and potentially jeopardizing my job. As I stood there, mop in hand, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could either continue trying to please everyone and slowly lose myself in the process, or I could take a stand and fight for my own happiness. With shaking hands, I typed out a response to Marge, "I'll be there." Then, taking a deep breath, I walked into the living room to face Edna and Lila. It was time to set some boundaries, no matter the consequences. The alarm blared at 3:30 a.m., jolting me awake. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Hank, and crept downstairs. As I reached for my car keys, the kitchen light flicked on. "And where do you think you're going?" Edna's voice was cold as ice. I steeled myself. "To work, Edna. I told you I have an early shift today." Her eyes narrowed. "Abandoning your family again, I see. Hank will be so disappointed." I bit back a retort and left, her words echoing in my head as I drove to the bakery. Hours later, covered in flour and exhausted, I returned home to chaos. Hank was pacing the living room, looking frantic. "Amy, where have you been? I've been calling for hours." Before I could explain, Edna swooped in. "Oh, Hank, I told you she doesn't care about us anymore, off gallivanting while we're dealing with a crisis." My heart dropped. "What crisis? What's happened?" Hank ran a hand through his hair. "It's Lila. She's in the hospital. She fell down the stairs this morning." Guilt washed over me. If I'd been here, "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "Is she okay?" "No thanks to you," Edna snapped. "If you'd been here to help her down the stairs like you're supposed to, this never would have happened." I stared at her, incredulous. "Help her down the stairs? Lila's a grown woman, not an invalid." Hank held up his hands. "Enough. We need to get to the hospital. Amy, are you coming or not?" The drive to the hospital was tense. When we arrived, we found Lila in a hospital bed, her arm in a cast but otherwise looking fine. "Oh, Amy," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "If only you'd been there to help me. I called out, but of course you were gone." I felt Hank stiffen beside me. "You called out? Why didn't you tell me that before, Lila?" She batted her eyelashes. "I didn't want to worry you, big brother. I know how stressed you've been lately." As Hank fussed over Lila, Edna cornered me in the hallway. "I hope you're satisfied," she hissed. "Your selfishness nearly cost Lila her life." Something in me snapped. "That's enough, Edna. We both know Lila's faking the severity of her fall. This manipulation has to stop." Edna's face turned purple with rage. "How dare you, after everything we've done for you?" Our raised voices drew Hank's attention. He emerged from Lila's room, looking confused. "What's going on out here?" I took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Hank, we need to talk, in private." We found an empty waiting room. I poured out everything, the constant criticism, the unreasonable demands, the emotional manipulation. Hank listened, his face growing more troubled with each word. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked softly. "I didn't want to put you in the middle," I admitted. "I know how much your family means to you." Hank was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, determination in his eyes. "This ends now. I'm going to talk to Mom and Lila." Hope bloomed in my chest as I watched him stride towards Lila's room. But as he opened the door, I heard Edna's voice, thick with tears. "Oh, Hank, thank goodness you're here. Amy, she said such horrible things, accusing poor Lila of lying about her fall. How could she be so cruel?" I froze, realizing too late the trap I'd walked into. Hank turned to me, his eyes filled with disappointment and anger. "Is this true, Amy? Did you really accuse my injured sister of lying?" In that moment, I saw my marriage balanced on a knife's edge. I could backpedal, try to smooth things over, or I could stand my ground and fight for the truth, even if it meant losing everything. Taking a deep breath, I made my choice. "Yes, Hank, I did, and I'll tell you why." I stood in the hospital hallway, my heart pounding as Hank's eyes bored into mine. The moment of truth had arrived, and I knew there was no going back. "Hank," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, "I need you to listen to me. Really listen. What's been happening in that house isn't right, and it's tearing us apart." His brow furrowed, but he nodded for me to continue. I took a deep breath and laid it all out. The constant criticism, the unreasonable demands, the emotional manipulation. With each word, I saw the confusion in Hank's eyes slowly turn to disbelief, then to anger. That's not possible," he stammered. "Mom and Lila wouldn't do that." Just then, Edna's shrill voice cut through the air. "Hank, come quick, Lila's in pain." We rushed back to Lila's room, where she lay dramatically clutching her side. "Oh, Amy," she whimpered. "If only you'd been there to help me this morning. The doctor says I might have internal bleeding." I felt the blood drain from my face. This was a new low, even for Lila. "That's not true," I said firmly. "I was just talking to the doctor. He said you had a minor sprain." Hank's head whipped between us, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. Edna seized the moment, her voice dripping with venom. "Are you calling my daughter a liar, Amy? How dare you?" The room seemed to close in around me. I could see Hank's resolve wavering, torn between his loyalty to his family and his trust in me. In that moment, I knew I had to make a choice, stay and fight a losing battle or walk away to save my own sanity. "I can't do this anymore," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Then, louder, "I'm leaving." The room fell silent. Hank reached for me, his eyes wide with panic. "Amy, wait." But I was already moving, my feet carrying me out of the room, down the hallway, out of the hospital. The cool night air hit my face as I burst through the doors, gulping in deep breaths. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. What had I done? Where would I go? As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the lights on in the house. Edna must have called ahead. Steeling myself, I walked inside. Lila was there, her arm miraculously healed enough to fold laundry. Edna stood in the kitchen, a look of smug satisfaction on her face. "Well, well," she said. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence." I ignored her, heading straight for the stairs. In our bedroom, I began throwing clothes into a suitcase, my hands shaking. "Amy?" Hank's voice came from the doorway. "What are you doing?" I turned to face him, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry, Hank. I can't live like this anymore. I love you, but I can't stay in this house another minute." His face crumpled. "Please, Amy. We can work this out. I'll talk to Mom and Lila, I promise." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He still didn't fully believe me, still couldn't see the truth about his family. "I need some time," I said, zipping up my suitcase. "I'll be at my sister's. When you're ready to really hear me, to see what's been happening, you know where to find me." As I walked down the stairs, suitcase in hand, Edna and Lila watched with matching expressions of triumph. But I held my head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. At the front door, I paused, looking back at Hank. He stood frozen at the top of the stairs, torn between following me and staying with his family. "I love you," I said softly. "But I love myself too, and I won't let anyone destroy that, not even for you." With those words, I walked out into the night, leaving behind the house that had become my prison. As I drove away, I felt a mix of terror and exhilaration. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The ball was in Hank's court now. Would he finally see the truth? Or had I just lost everything I held dear? 3 days had passed since I'd left Hank and his family. I sat in my sister's guest room, staring at my silent phone, willing it to ring. The waiting was excruciating, but I knew I had to stand my ground. A knock at the door startled me. My sister Sarah poked her head in. "Amy, there's someone here to see you." My heart leaped. Could it be Hank? I rushed downstairs, hope blooming in my chest, but as I reached the living room, that hope withered and died. Edna stood there, her face a mask of concern. "Oh, Amy," she cooed, "we've been so worried about you." I felt my body go rigid. "What are you doing here, Edna?" She stepped closer, her voice low. "I've come to bring you home, dear. Hank is beside himself with grief. He needs you." For a moment, I wavered. The thought of Hank in pain was almost unbearable. But then I saw the glint in Edna's eyes, the barely concealed triumph. "No," I said firmly, "I'm not going anywhere with you." Edna's facade cracked. "Now listen here, you ungrateful little—" "Is there a problem?" Sarah's voice cut through the tension. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, glaring at Edna. Edna's smile returned, sickeningly sweet. "Not at all. I was just leaving." She turned to me. "Think about what you're throwing away, Amy. Hank won't wait forever." As the door closed behind her, I collapsed onto the couch, shaking. Sarah sat beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "You did the right thing," she murmured. "Stay strong." Hours later, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, my phone buzzed. A text from Hank. "Can we talk, please?" My fingers hovered over the keys. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to protect myself from more pain, but I knew we needed to have this conversation. Tomorrow, noon, the park by the lake. The next day, I arrived at the park early, my stomach in knots. I spotted Hank on a bench, looking as haggard as I felt. Amy, he breathed, standing as I approached. I'm so sorry for everything. I held up a hand, stopping him. Before you say anything else, I need you to listen. Really listen. For the next hour, I laid it all out. Every cruel comment, every unreasonable demand, every manipulation. I showed him texts and emails, recounted conversations. With each revelation, I saw the color drain from Hank's face. I had no idea, he whispered, his voice breaking. How could I have been so blind? Because they're your family, I said softly, and you love them. Hank reached for my hand, his eyes pleading. I love you, Amy, more than anything. Please come home. We'll face this together. I'll set boundaries, I promise. I wanted so badly to believe him, but doubt gnawed at me. And what happens the next time Lila needs something? Or your mother guilt trips you? Can you really stand up to them? His silence was deafening. I can't go back to that house, Hank, I said, my voice trembling. I won't survive it. Hank's face crumpled. Then I'll leave. We'll get our own place. Start fresh. I stared at him, hardly daring to hope. You'd do that? Leave your family? He nodded, determination replacing the anguish in his eyes. You're my family, Amy. You're my home. I choose you. Tears spilled down my cheeks as Hank pulled me into his arms. For the first time in months, I felt safe, loved, understood. But as we clung to each other, a chill ran down my spine. I knew this was far from over. Edna and Lila wouldn't let us go without a fight. As if on cue, my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You'll regret this, Amy. No one takes my son away from me. I showed the message to Hank, watching his face harden with resolve. We're in this together, he said firmly. Whatever comes next, we face it as a team. I nodded, squaring my shoulders. The real battle was just beginning. But this time I wasn't fighting alone. My hands trembled as Hank and I stood on the doorstep of his childhood home. We'd come to collect our belongings and make a final stand against Edna and Lila's manipulation. The air felt thick with tension as Hank rang the doorbell. Edna answered, her face a mask of concern. Oh, Hank, thank goodness you're home. We've been so worried. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me. Amy, I see you've brought her back. Hank's voice was firm. Mom, we need to talk. All of us. We followed Edna into the living room where Lila sat, her arm miraculously healed. The sight of her smug smile made my blood boil. What's this about? Edna demanded, her saccharine tone evaporating. Hank took a deep breath. Amy and I are leaving, for good. We're getting our own place. The room fell silent. Then Edna laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Don't be ridiculous, Hank. This is your home. Your family needs you. No, Mom, Hank said, his voice steady. What I need is to be with my wife, away from the manipulation and abuse. Lila gasped dramatically. Abuse? How dare you, after everything we've done for you both? I couldn't stay silent any longer. Everything you've done? You mean like treating me like a servant? Constantly criticizing and belittling me? Faking injuries to guilt trip us? Edna's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little witch. You've poisoned my son against us. She lunged at me, but Hank stepped between us. That's enough, Mom. I've seen the truth now. The way you've treated Amy, the way you've tried to control me. It stops today. Lila burst into tears. How can you do this to us, Hank? We're your family. Amy is my family now, Hank replied, his voice softening. I love you both, but I won't let you destroy my marriage. Edna's demeanor changed instantly, her voice dripping with honey. Darling, we only want what's best for you. Amy clearly doesn't understand our family dynamics. Give it time. She'll adjust. I felt a surge of pride as Hank shook his head. No, Mom. There's nothing to adjust to. Amy and I are leaving. We've already found an apartment across town. The shock on Edna and Lila's faces was almost comical. As Hank and I moved to gather our things, they followed, alternating between pleas and threats. You'll regret this, Hank, Edna hissed. When she leaves you, don't come crawling back. Hank paused at the foot of the stairs, turning to face his mother and sister. The only thing I regret is not seeing the truth sooner. Goodbye, Mom. Lila, I hope someday you'll understand. As we loaded the last of our boxes into the car, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Hank pulled me close, pressing a kiss to my forehead. I'm so proud of you, I whispered. He smiled, a mix of sadness and relief in his eyes. I'm proud of us. It won't be easy, but we're in this together. As we drove away, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt hope blooming in my chest. We pulled up to our new apartment, a modest one-bedroom that already felt more like home than the house we'd left behind. As we carried our boxes inside, I caught Hank looking at me, his eyes shining with love and determination. "You know," he said, setting down a box, "in a way, we should thank my mom and Lila." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and why's that?" He pulled me into his arms. "Because they showed us how strong we are together. We faced the worst and came out stronger. Nothing can tear us apart now." Tears pricked my eyes as I hugged him fiercely. He was right. We'd weathered a storm that could have destroyed us, and instead it had forged our bond into something unbreakable. As we unpacked, filling our new home with laughter and love, I realized that this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. Hank and I had reclaimed our lives, our relationship, and our future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, stronger and wiser for the battle we'd won. And as the sun set on our first night in our new home, I knew that the best was yet to come.